from Raisable Faith. Glad you all could make it today. As for announcements, despite this Saturday being the first weekend of the month, we are not going to be having Pancakes Pontification this Saturday. But I think we're still deciding on whether or not it is going to be deferred to next weekend.
Why are you not having it? What's going on this weekend?
Aren't you getting married?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I thought you were going to say something about like celebrating Easter or something. Congratulations. That's fun.
Well, you'll never forget your anniversary now.
So there's that, and then I think that's the only big thing that's happening. Of course, this is going to be our Easter talk, so I'm glad you all can make it for that. So I'll hand it over to.
All right, thanks. And congratulations on getting married.
Thank you.
That's exciting. Marriage is like a slumber party that never ends. That's what marriage is like. There's my advice to you. I got really nothing else, so nothing, absolutely nothing else. Yeah. All right, so we are talking about the resurrection and that's why I guess because we're closer to Easter, but I guess as marriage is taking precedence over the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the like, so we're asking the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? All right. That's when, of course, the answer is yes. Then the resurrection is true. And in fact, if you get the resurrection, you pretty much get Christianity, is what you get. All right. I mean, basically a mere Christianity is what you get. If you don't get the resurrection, well, you don't get Christianity at all. Because as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, he stated that if Christ is not risen from the dead, then your faith is in vain. My preaching is in vain, and the like. So you might get Judaism, you might get Islam, or some kind of deism because maybe the arguments for God's existence still get pushed through and the like. But you do have to get the resurrection in order to get Christianity, I believe, itself. Now, when you ask this question, did Jesus rise from the dead? I want you to notice that this is a historical question, right? And since it's something that happened in the past, it's past tense. Did Jesus, not will Jesus, rise from the dead? Did he rise from the dead? And that is definitely a historical question. And since it's a historical question, you have to do historical investigation is what you have to do. All right. Now, anybody here a history major? Exactly. Who would want to be a freaking history major? That doesn't pay. You want to know why I know that?
How do you know that?
I got a history major. That's what I got. Seriously, and then if that wasn't enough, it's like one of the lowest paying degrees that you can get.
I know a history PhD student from this student who's homeless right now.
Wow, thanks for that. That really does it. That blesses my heart. That bless my heart, dear. The old ladies say, bless your heart. That is not a compliment. All right. So, anyways, bless your heart. So, anyways, and then if that wasn't enough, I went and got an education degree, and that is again one of the lowest paying degrees that you can get. And if that wasn't enough, I went on and got a theology degree. And that is one of the lowest paying jobs and degrees that you can get. Other than that, I guess I could get a philosophy degree, and that's just like completely useless. I just look at my brother and I go, man, you're freaking useless. He's got a PhD in philosophy. I said, he might be right, but at least with theology, I'm going to heaven. So anyways, back to the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? It is a historical question. And which means we have to do a historical investigation. Now, to do that, I'm going to have to teach you how historians do their job real quickly. But most of the time when you think about, well, that just doesn't sound all that gripping. How do historians do their job? It's just not all that exciting. They don't make like movies about historians, and the like. And if they do, they usually bomb, royally, and the like. It's usually like crime dramas that actually make the big money. Have you ever thought about that, like on TV shows, on TV? The most popular genre is crime dramas. And the reason I bring up crime dramas is doing history is much like being a detective. It's actually very, very similar. It's specifically a certain type of detective called a cold case detective. You ever heard of cold cases before? What's a cold case?
Unsolved for a long time.
Yeah, unsolved for a long time. There you go. And they even have TV shows, like Cold Case. That's one of the name of the shows. But another show is called 48 Hours. And the reason they call it 48 Hours is you basically have to solve the crime within 48 hours or it dramatically drops off your ability to solve the crime, hence 48 Hours. Interestingly enough, there was a crime in Dallas that showed up on 48 Hours, and then my wife served on the jury for that case. Yeah, it was pretty wild. So it is a murder case, and everything, and she was telling me all about it. She couldn't tell me at the time, but she was telling me all. She loves serving on juries. She thinks that's the coolest thing. She's just weird. In fact, she loves crime drama. She goes to sleep watching crime dramas, on her phone. And I'm like, dude, you're going to sleep to people being killed. I'm sleeping with one eye open with you around. I mean, that's sort of sick in the head, Yeah, I know. I mean, seriously, this is very.
Watch horror movies. I have anxiety.
Yeah, there you go. At least watch a horror movie. It's not real, but crime dramas, that stuff could really happen. So anyways, back to crime dramas. A historian is very much like a detective, right? If you think about like a cold case detective, they're looking at an event in the distant past, right? That's why it's called a cold case, with no eyewitnesses, little to no forensic evidence, but convincing circumstantial evidence. And it could be up to decades after the event. There's only one really case they pursue as cold case detectives. It's usually homicides, because most crimes have a statute of limitation, but homicides don't. I mean, there's some exceptions there, but it's homicides that are usually the cold cases that they're going after. But if you think about the case of how historians do their job, well, they're doing just that. They're looking at an event in the distant past with no living eyewitnesses, little to no forensic evidence, but convincing circumstantial evidence. The only difference between a detective and a historian is a detective is looking at a criminal event in the past, and a historian is looking at any event in the past, right? Which makes them boring, because I mean, seriously, let's look at the economics of the Middle Ages. Oh, that's gripping. So anyways, I mean, you can actually get degrees in that kind of stuff. It's like, I got a degree on the economics of Northern France during the 14th century. It's like, you do not have a girlfriend, do you? All right, so anyways. So, that's funny. I make myself laugh sometimes. All right, so anyways.
Step on some toes here.
Yeah, I was about to unleash on this group, but then I stopped because you know what? He's getting married. So there you go. I mean, it wouldn't really hit like it really should. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop while I'm ahead. So anyways. All right, so that being the case, while being a historian doesn't sound exciting, being a detective is quite exciting. They make TV shows about it and the like. They write books about it, crime novels and the like. So like when let's pretend like we're like at a detective school, and I'm training you how to be, detectives. And we get a call, and there's a guy that's dead in Garland, because that's where I live. That's where all the crimes occur in Dallas, is in Garland, because I'm a high school teacher with a degree in history and education and theology. I can't afford anything else. So I live in Garland where all the crime occurs. And so we go out there and we got this dead guy laying on the ground, right? And there's different reasons he could be dead. What are some of the reasons a guy could be dead?
Black ice.
Black ice, what?
It's where the road is like frozen.
Okay, well, you're very specific. With that reason, I'm not going to ask why. So it seems like there's some backstory there, but I don't want to hear it. All right, so anyways, because if I asked, that would act like I care about what you have to say, but I don't. So I mean, I know that's rude. But teaching is just acting. Have you ever noticed that about teaching? It's acting like you're angry, acting like you care, things like that. All right, so anyways, let's get a little more broad than black ice. The guy's dead in a house, right? What reasons could be dead generally?
Murder. Murder.
Murder's one. Homicide. What's another?
Robbery gone wrong.
Yeah, that's still murder. All right.
But it's
What are some other ones?
It's not premeditated. There's premeditated.
Yeah, I don't want to go there. All right, just murder.
An accident.
So accidental death. Slipped and fell. All right. What's another reason?
Natural causes.
Disease.
Natural death, or one more.
Accident. Well,
You got homicide.
suicide.
There you go, suicide. You got homicide, suicide, accidental death, natural death. All right? But that all explains why there's a dead guy in the house. And we as detectives got to figure out which one it is. All right? So as a detective, you go into the scene and what are you looking for? Evidence, some clues is what you're looking for. All right? And so what we notice is there's a pool of blood around the dead guy on the floor. That tends to rule out what? Most natural deaths do not end up, I mean, there's exceptions, obviously, but most of them do not end up with the pool of blood, accidental death. Natural death. All right, so we still have accidental death, homicide, suicide. And so we look into the scene, we're looking for more. Evidence, there you go. All right, and we notice there's a knife sticking out of his back. All right, now with the knife sticking out of his back, that definitely rules out what?
Accident.
Yeah, accidental death. It's definitely not. So it's not natural death. Doesn't seem to be accidental death unless he was learning how to juggle and he started with knives. And that's called stupidity, death by stupid. All right. So, but we still have like homicide or suicide. He could have like tried to get the insurance payout. So he's trying to look like a homicide, And so he looked for some more evidence, and we notice there's multiple stab wounds in his back. Right? That tends to rule out what? Suicide, So we've already ruled out accidental death. We already ruled out natural death. Yeah. This seems to rule out suicide. I mean, to be able to stab yourself in the back multiple times. I don't know what's going on. All right. Oddly enough, that's my brother calling. All right. So maybe I'll just hand the phone to you. So. All right, so, and then we look at some more clues or evidence, and we see some bloody footprints. Was it something I said? Was I rude? People just walking out on me in my middle of my presentation. So I know I'm not that entertaining, but man. All right, so anyways, what was the last clue? Was we see bloody footprints walking away from the dead guy. This seems to point towards what?
Another person.
Yeah, so it looks like it's a
murder.
Yeah, homicide. There you go. All right, so notice with the detective, it's basically a two-stage process, right, to what's going on. All right, you look for the clues, right, or you're looking for evidence, and then you solve the case, right? So as a detective, right, basically detectives look for clues or evidence, and then they try to solve the case, right? You don't solve the case before you look for the clues, right? You'd be a crappy detective, right? You don't invert it. And you want to get as many clues as you can. And then when you solve the case, the way it's solved, it will explain all the clues. Does this make sense? And historians do the same thing. They just call it something different. What historians do is they look for historical facts, all right? And after they gather their historical facts, they provide the best explanation of the facts, right? And they're doing the same thing, they just call it something different, so you have to get different degrees, yeah.
I want to ask if you want to qualify something. You said you solve the case, and
after you get the clues.
The solution will solve all the clues, but you don't have to solve all the clues, right? Just the maximal maybe.
Yeah, I would qualify that. That's a fine qualification. Because there might be some clues you're just like, we don't know this, but this is the best explanation we have because it explains most of the clues. And your desire, obviously, is for it to explain all the clues. And that would be the same in history. You provide the best explanation and it explains most of the facts that you've gathered. It might not explain them all, but you want to explain all of them if you can. All right, so absolutely no problem with that qualification. All right, so that's how do historians actually do this first process, establishing historical facts, all right? This is what they do, all right? So to establish historical facts, they look for basically 4 things to say, yeah, that actually what happened in the past, all right? Then basically I'm teaching you how do historians figure out what happened in the past, because, you know, have you ever sat in like history class and they're talking about some ancient event? Have you ever like had your mind wander and you're like, how do they know that happened? I mean, that history teacher is old, but they're not that old. You know, I mean, I have this one history teacher at school. I mean, he might have been at the Revolutionary War. I mean, he is that freaking old, but he wasn't there, you know, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, you know, so how do we know that actually happened, right? So this is how historians establish facts about the past, right? They want 4 things, right? One, they want the fact in an early source, all right? So I haven't actually written on a whiteboard probably in decades. All right, so technology has ruined me. All right, so like why a detective goes to like a crime scene, an historian goes like to an archive, right? That's their crime scene. And so like I remember I took some 8th graders years ago to Washington, D.C., because that's what 8th grade classes do every spring, is they go to Washington, D.C. And one of the places we went is down to Mount Vernon, where George Washington resided. And we all get out and we go to the museum and we go look at his house. But what most 8th graders and even, you know, history teachers miss when they take these students is across the street is the Washington Archive. And that's where historians go. They go into the archive and they're looking for clues. They're looking, hey, can we discover anything that no one else has discovered? And they have like the letters of Washington and the executive orders, you know, and his orders as a general. It has his diary. It might have letters to George Washington from other dignitaries or from his wife, or a letter to his wife, Martha Washington, and the like. And so they're going in there and they're digging for clues is what they're doing. And if they find something, they're like, oh, no one's ever reported on this before. The first thing you want to know is does this come from an early source, right? Because earlier is better. I mean, if it's hundreds and hundreds of years after the event, I mean, it doesn't mean it didn't occur, but it really puts a damper on it, you know, to what's going on. This is just called common sense. This is what you get a degree in, common sense in history. You want it close to the event, not far away from the event. You know, so like, for example, you're taking notes. Just go with me on this, all right? You're taking notes. Your phone's out. Act like you're taking notes. Go ahead. Yeah, there you go. You're taking notes, right? No, you're not taking notes. Don't suck up. All right, so anyways, you're taking notes as I'm talking about how historians discover the past, right? But you're not taking notes, okay? You were acting like you were taking notes, but you are listening, and I appreciate that. And 5 years from now, you're going to say to yourself, man, Steve's lecture on the resurrection was freaking amazing. I should have took notes, but you doggone it, I paid attention. I wasn't sleeping like those guys in the back. You know, I'm going to write everything down I remember. Well, whose notes are you going to prefer?
This guy.
Yeah, because it's closer to the event
Right here.
than here. Now, I'm sure you could remember some things 5 years after the event, but as time moves on, memory fades, you know, or the like, whatever happens, you know. So, early source. Make sense? All right. Second thing that historians look for to establish facts about the past is they want it from multiple independent sources. All right? Multiple independent. What does multiple mean?
Many, more than
Yeah, more than one. And independent means they're not
Influencing each other.
Yeah, they're not, you know, using each other. All right, what time we get out? I can't remember.
well, 8, but I mean,
We'll go 8:15. All right,
they're not
there
gonna
you go.
take us out or
Yeah, no, they're not. All right, so you know, all right. Or if you get bored of me, you can just get up and walk out, and we'll end. All right, so multiple independent sources, right? So when you get an early source, and then you find another source independent of the early source that says pretty much the same thing, then that increases your confidence that hey, this event probably happened. You know, is what's going on. It's sort of like if you ever like attended classes and one day you missed. Well, what do you do when you come back to class? Well, you turn to your fellow student and say, can I borrow your notes? And you copy the notes. Now, if they actually make a mistake There's Sloan again. I'll just tell him, you ought to show up to my lectures if you want to talk to me. All right. So, what was it? Oh yeah. So you get your friend's notes, you copy them, and if they made a mistake, is there any way you know is there any way you can know they made a mistake just looking at their notes? No. But what could you, not that you would do this, this takes way too much effort as a student, but what could you do?
Cross-validate.
Yeah, you go to another student, and they got to see your notes, and you compare and contrast, and if they didn't copy each other, they're independent of each other, and they pretty much say the same thing, then yeah, that's probably what occurred, you know? I mean, they don't say the exact same thing, because maybe they use different words, or they ordered it differently, or synonyms, or abbreviations, you know, or the like. But if they produce like, oh yeah, that's what occurred, they both say the same thing, then that's probably what occurred. All right, so multiple independent sources. The third thing that historians do to establish facts about the past, it's got to be early, got to be multiple, and it's got to lack legendary development. All right, lacks legendary development, or this is what I sort of call like the ring of truth to it. It's like, yeah, that sounds like what could have occurred, right, in that situation. So like, let's say you miss class, you come back to class, you say, hey, what happened in class? And your fellow student says, man, you missed it. Steve got drunk on vodka, danced all over the tables, and stripped down to his skivvies. And you'd be like, wow, I really missed the wrong class. Or maybe that was the right class to miss, depending on your perspective. Yeah, I missed that one, you know.
I want to see it.
Yeah, hey, let's see it. But then, as you notice, as I walk in to teach the class, you'd be like, that would probably get him fired unless he taught at UTD. You know, so that actually might get him, but more people would sign up for the class, you know, so, but that would probably get me fired at Prestwood Christian Academy, you know, where I teach. But if I'm still teaching there, then you're like, dude, you're making this up, you're joshing with me, that sounds like legendarily developed, you know, that's just a fancy academic way of saying, the legend of the drunk Steve. All right, is this being recorded or just being aired?
It is.
All right, there you go. All right, last thing to establish a fact about the past, got to be early, multiple, lack of legendary development. There's no competing and compelling, I don't know if I'm spelling this right, compelling story or narrative against it. All right? So is what's going on, right? There's no one else saying, oh, something else happened. Like, so if you miss class and you say, hey, what did we do in class? And one says, oh, we took notes on the resurrection. But then you ask a fellow student and said, no, we had a study hall. Then you're like, whoa, I don't know what happened now. Did they take notes? Did they have a study hall? What's going on here? You know? Now, what makes a competing story compelling? The three criteria above it. It's got to be early, got to be multiple, got to lack embellishment as well, right? That's what historians look for. There are other things that historians look for as well, but that will at least get us going because only have 40 minutes left, right? You know, or less. All right, any questions about this?
40 minutes, please.
Okay, there you go. Any questions about how historians do this? All right, you track with me on it? All right. That being the case, let's actually put this into practice real quick. All right, and I don't know, this might be a little dangerous, all right? So there's a story, I mentioned George Washington just moments ago, right? Yeah. About a young George Washington who got an axe one day, and he went out to his father's field, and he chopped down his dad's prized cherry tree. Have you ever heard this story before? All right? And then his dad comes home, you know, walking the fields, and he says, who thou now cut down thy cherry tree? Because that's how they talk in colonial America, right? And what does George Washington do? Well, he confesses. He says, I cannot tell a lie. It was I, you know? And he got the tar beat out of him, right? Yes, because that's what they do in colonial America, right? Now, let's apply this criteria to the story of George Washington chopping down his dad's cherry tree. Does it come from an early source? No. Well, the answer is no. It doesn't come from early. So the earliest source of information we have of George Washington chopping down his dad's cherry tree is a book called On the Life of George Washington by a guy named Parson, which means like pastor, Mason Weems. Weems. That's a very unfortunate last name. All right, there you go. I mean, what else are you going to go into except into a pastoral ministry, with a name like Weems? All right. And it was written like in 1839. Now, that's not early because George Washington died in 1799. And this is an event that when he was like 10, 12 years old, so this is like 80 years after the event. So it's not early. If you want an early source of information on George Washington, you can go to his diaries, right? He actually wrote things as a kid, like rules and behaviors for life, and the like. I mean, we got a very early source of information about George Washington. It's not an early source, all right? Do we have any other independent sources of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree? And the answer is no. This is the only source of information we have of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. And then we ask, is it legendarily developed? Well, what do kids do when they're about to get in trouble? They lie. But what does he do? He tells the truth. But how does he tell it? I cannot tell a lie. It was I. Seriously, he freaking rhymes his confession. I'm going to put it to a ditty. That's what I'm going to do. That's my British Scott, brogue, George Washington.
I think even the kind of rhythm of his answer
has a cadence to it, right there. Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds a little bit embellished. And of course, we don't have to look at any competing stories that are compelling because this story doesn't meet the first three conditions. So historians actually don't say it didn't occur. They designate it as we don't know, right? Because maybe we could find something else. Maybe someone will find, like an earlier source and that might confirm it. But right now, it's like, we don't know, probably not, unlikely or essentially, here's what's going on. There's lots of things that's happened in the past. History, which is done like this, moves events in the past into the category of history. And history are the things that we know that happened in the past. All right, that's what history is. The events that we do know happened in the past. There are lots of things in the past, and most of it we really don't care about. It's usually the major events that we want to know about, and this is how we figure them out. Is this making sense to y'all? Yeah.
I don't know if this would be the right time to make this point, but I feel like it may get lost if we move beyond it. One thing I think is that's a fantastic illustration. Because the time isn't incredibly different from that of Jesus's death and resurrection, right? Between the George Washington and the story. But more specifically, what makes that, there's an element of what is the motive that someone would have to make up a story about Washington, right? He's an American hero. It's the kind of thing that people would like to say that George Washington.
Well, remember the book was written in 1839. What's going on in America? We're about to move into what?
Civil War.
Yeah, Civil War. I mean, our nation is about to be split. It's been split really. With the what is it, the Kansas Resolution? I don't know what they call it. Where it's like northern states are free, southern states are slaved. Something like that. I can't remember. I mean, it's been divided for decades up to that point, and it's getting ramped up. And Parson Mason Weems is like, dude, we need to bring our nation together. What better way to bring our nation together than to appeal to one of our founders, is what we do. And George Washington was an unbelievably honest individual. All right, so we actually do know that, And so maybe, he heard this story is passed on. It got legendarily developed along the way. We do have like the records of when he was a kid where he said, always tell the truth, and things like that. So we do know this about George Washington, and maybe that's what Parson Mason Weems is doing. We can't say it didn't occur. We just don't know if it did occur.
There's something about, the way that people look at evidence that maybe would be kind of implicit in what you intend the fourth point to be there, where if it's something that's a little bit too convenient, like, if we're looking for the murder suspect and someone says, oh, well, my, cellmate in jail said that this guy did it, and that guy's dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, there's not really any evidence. Maybe he did live close, but it's like, it's just so convenient that somebody has named this dead person so that the case can be put to rest.
Yeah.
That in and of itself kind of raises the question of like, okay, Is there no alternative motive for someone
Yeah.
putting that forward?
Especially when you don't have the others. Especially when you don't have the others. I think that's what occurs. Now, that being the case, this is how historians establish historical facts, or how they uncover their clues, if you like the detective motif. This is how they establish historical facts. I think there are actually 4 facts about the fate of Jesus. 4 facts about Jesus that meet these 4 conditions. All right? And here are the 4 facts. All right? If you can remember the acronym BEAT, B-E-A-T, all right? Or Jesus beat death. See what I did there?
Yeah.
All right, there you go. All right, so Jesus beat death. You can remember these 4 facts. Here are the 4 facts. The burial, all right, of Jesus. The empty tomb. The appearances of Jesus. And the transformation of the disciples. All right. And so what I'm going to do in the short time that I have, all right, is I'm going to go through each fact to see how it meets the 4 conditions. All right. That's what I'm going to do. So let's take a look at the burial. All right. The first fact says that after Jesus died, all right, so there's the word burial represents all of the following. All right. After Jesus died, he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. All right. So how do we know Jesus died? Well, Roman soldiers are really good at doing what? Killing people. I mean, that's their job. We got a 1988 journal called the JAMA Journal, for short, for the Journal of the American Medical Association. That's one of the premier medical journals in the world, definitely in America. They wrote an article called On the Physical Death of Jesus. This is actually 1986, sorry, March. And you can actually look it up online. On the Physical Death of Jesus, Google it, and you'll see the whole article. Right? And it actually goes through what happens, not, theologically or spiritually to Jesus, but what happened to Jesus anatomically or medically, physiologically what happened to Jesus. And they actually go through what happens when someone is whipped, and we actually know quite a bit about Roman crucifixion. Probably the earliest sources are the 4 Gospels about crucifixion, but Josephus mentions them. We have archaeological evidence of crucifixions. Hundreds of thousands of people were actually crucified. It was their mode of capital punishment, right, is what it was. And they concluded in the article, the 1986 On the Physical Death of Jesus, that Jesus, and this was done by 2 historians, 1 historian and 2 medical doctors, all right, that did this article. And they said he certainly died before he was removed from the cross. All right, he either died from asphyxiation, the inability to breathe, or definitely from the spear side in his side. And remember what flowed out of the side? Blood and water. All right, and the reason it looked like water is it almost certainly hit the heart, and around the heart is a pericardial sac of liquid, a clear liquid that protects the heart, because that is basically a electronic bomb going off every 3 seconds or whatever when your heart's beating, and it's protecting your heart, protecting the rest of your body, and it pierced that pericardial sac, and hence it looks like blood and water flowed out. That's the most likely explanation. All right, so he certainly died. It's one of the best attested facts about Jesus, is that he died. All right, now after Jesus died, they buried him in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Right? And then we know that he was buried because this is actually recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It says, after Jesus died, they buried him. All right? Now, 1 Corinthians 15, very early, the book of Corinthians is a very, very early source. It's like pre-40s, all right, is what it is. And when you look at 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 1, Paul goes on to say, as I received, I am now delivering to you, meaning he didn't come up with it. He got it himself, probably from the disciples in Jerusalem when he was visiting them, according to Galatians, I think chapter 3 or 4. And he actually goes and then says, and Jesus was crucified, he died, and he was buried. And what happens is it changes from this Greek grammar to this Aramaic type of grammar. Right? Meaning that was the spoken language, not the written language, meaning it was probably an early creed of the church. John Donne of King's University in London said this creed, 1 Corinthians 3, 4, and 5, dates within 5 years of the life of Jesus. So 5 years of the life of Jesus, well, that's pretty early, all right? About an individual, 5 years after the event, all right? Now, some of you are like, oh, come on, 5 years after, well, compared to other ancient sources. 5 years is actually kicking butt, is what's going on. Like, for example, the political ruler during the day of Jesus was Tiberius Caesar, the most important political figure of the time. And the earliest biographical information we have of his life is 77 years after his life. So we have information that's within 5 years of Jesus, right? Is what's going on. And it's not like the disciples are like sitting on the information, not talking about it. I mean, what happens to them according to the book of Acts? They go out and they start telling everybody about it. And one of the keys to memorization is repetition, doing it over and over and over and over and over again. And the more you all know your names, right? Why do you know your names? Because your parents kept calling you that until you answer to it, just like dogs. So anyways, it's just called repetition. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to point out that the letter of the Corinthians, it is written, I think the latest is typically dated like 45, right? 45?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
In the 40s.
So
It could be earlier.
Right. So
You know?
it has to be some years before that creed.
Yeah, for the creed itself. Some say maybe 15 years. James D.G. Dunn says 5 years. Some scholars even say 18 months.
Even if you average
that,
you get
I don't know if it's 18 months, year and a half, but it's within a decade.
Yeah.
So what's real important about it, I think, is eyewitnesses are what?
Alive.
They're still alive when this is being produced and told and talked about. I think that's what's really important about it. Yeah.
So are you saying that 1 Corinthians was written in the mid-40s?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I've always seen it quoted as like more so early 50s to mid-40s.
No, I wouldn't. Now, look, there's the debate among scholars, right? And here, I'll let you know my presupposition about the New Testament. I believe the entire New Testament was written before 70 AD. All of it.
Including John?
All of it.
Really?
Every single book of the New Testament was written before 70 AD.
Including Revelation?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. All you got to read is, I can't remember the guy's name. All right. Let me see. I have the physical book, But John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, back in the 60s, he was no Christian-friendly scholar, by the way, but he actually wrote a book called Redating the Gospels, all right? And gosh, I can't remember this guy's name.
Redating the New Testament.
Yeah, Redating the New Testament.
Robinson.
Yeah, and he said, it was all written before AD 70, right? And then there was another guy that just recently came out dating the New Testament. And I can't remember the name of the author. Book.
Google says Corinthians AD 53 to 55, but I think you can kind of average those out and the point still stands.
Yeah, but I think it's actually earlier than that. And I'll give one reason why, and then I got to move on, okay? Anybody know what happened in AD 70?
The destruction of the temple.
Yeah, and Jerusalem. They destroyed the entire city, kicked all the Jews out, said you can't live here anymore. And guess what's not mentioned anywhere in the New Testament?
Destruction of Jerusalem.
The destruction of Jerusalem is not mentioned in the New Testament anywhere. Yeah, definitely not in the past tense.
Referenced in Mark 13.
Yeah, it could be, but that's if you presuppose that prophecies cannot occur.
It's if, there you go.
But if there's good reason to think God exists, then prophecies are a possibility. I don't have a problem with that. So you just got to back the argument up to, okay, now we got to figure out if God exists or not.
Right.
Well, I actually think, I think we have good reason to think God exists. He's the best explanation for morality in the universe. He's the best explanation for the origin of the universe. He's the best explanation for the design of the universe, and so on and so on. If God exists, then, well, miracles are possible, like prophecies. So I think that's on the table. But I don't even have to. I don't have to do that.
Yeah, no, I think.
Look, here's the deal, all right? The book of Acts, Luke Acts, right, written by the author Luke, he centers literarily the books around the city of Jerusalem. It is literarily structured around it. I don't have time to go into what chiastic structure is, this parallel structure, all around the city of Jerusalem. If you know anything about the New Testament, there's a very, very famous passage, Acts 1:8, that says, "You'll be my disciples in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth." That is the literary structure of both Luke. It starts at the ends of the earth, moves to Samaria, moves to Judea, and then the end of the book of Luke, all the action ends up in Jerusalem, the death, resurrection of Jesus. That book of Acts mirrors that in the reverse order. It's Acts, then Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. The ends of the earth is Rome, as you know, because they don't know anything else about the world, except for Rome. And they focus on Jerusalem, and guess what he does not mention? The destruction of Jerusalem. And if the literary structure of the book is around the city of Jerusalem, and he doesn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem, I think this is a good indication that Luke Acts was written before AD 70. It'd be like me getting a history book on New York City. I'll read the entire book about New York City, and it doesn't mention 9/11. What do I know about when that book was published?
Before 2001.
Yeah, before 2001, September 11th, right? And I'm just going to let you in a secret. As bad as September 11th was 2001, it was a drop in the bucket compared to what happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD. All right. You can also look at Hebrews, which talks about the superiority of Christ over, and it uses this in the present tense, the sacrificial system in the temple, which is implying that the temple still exists. His point in Hebrews is to say Jesus is superior to the sacrificial system in the temple. What better argument to make then, and the temple doesn't exist anymore, hence why we trust in Christ and is superior to the sacrificial system that can't even be practiced anymore. All right? So if Hebrews is before 70, Luke is before 70, Acts is before 70, well, all the scholars, and there's disagreement on this, most academic scholars believe Mark was the earliest gospel written. And all of Paul's writings, that was a little overclaim. Most of Paul's writings were before any of the Gospels, including 1 Corinthians, right? Galatians is probably one of the earliest, right, to what's going on. But we're just here looking at 1 Corinthians 15, this creed. The scholars are saying within 5 to 10 years of the life of Jesus himself, all right? So we know he was buried, all right? And then this oral creed dating within 5 years of Jesus. We also know that the burial story is mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, all right, which is the earliest gospel. And if Luke Acts is before AD 70, well then Mark's before that, maybe 50s, 60s, So this is, again, now we have early source and multiple sources is what we have. Also, the burial story doesn't sound legendarily embellished, does it? Jesus died and they buried him. That's what we do to dead people today, don't we? When they die, we tend to bury them. So no legendary embellishment, and there's no competing compelling story against the death and burial of Jesus. All right? Now, there is a guy named John Dominic Crossan who would say, oh, yeah, he died. They moved his body from the cross and they threw him in a shallow grave with other criminals. Well, that's what they did do to people who died on crosses, but does he have an early source for that? No. Does he have multiple sources of that? No. And, at this point, it's embellished because you're just making this up. You're actually not doing the historical method anymore. You're just speculating is what you're doing. Yeah.
I feel like I've heard it claimed, though, that it would be really strange for them to have buried someone who was a crucifixion victim, but I also have heard that, competing claims to that. So.
Yeah.
That goes back and forth.
Yeah, it does that, but look, okay, I'll just put it like this. In 1969, they uncovered an ossuary. An ossuary is a bone box where they kept the bones of Jewish people. And in the bone box, on the outside of the bone box, it was the guy named John, right? They had his name. And inside the bone box, they had a heel bone. And in the heel bone, guess what they had? A nail sticking through it, meaning he was crucified. And what did he receive? Unhonorable burial is what's going on.
And Josephus mentions that there are occasions that he knows of them taking crucified people down off the cross. So I think the question kind of comes back to just the idea of is Jesus special enough? Is it the kind of thing that could happen for Jesus? I think the point stands, that skeptics and Crossan make. It's like, well, yeah, sure. Normally they just throw criminals, but it's certainly.
Well, we got some good
you
clues here to think otherwise.
Well, and Jesus is a special person, right? I mean, they wouldn't, he's a special person. So I think it rings true and the kind of thing. It's like, yeah, they could have done that. I mean,
Yeah. All right, I'm going to have to pick up the pace here, right? That's what I have to do, all right? Which means I got to shut you up, all right? That's what I got to do. All right, now that's all right. Another reason we think the burial story is accurate is Joseph of Arimathea buried him. Very unlikely to be a Christian invention, having a Jew, which the Jews had Jesus crucified, wanted him crucified, to have him being buried. And if they made this up about Joseph of Arimathea, well, the Jewish Sanhedrin, which Joseph of Arimathea was apparently on, and if there was no Joseph of Arimathea, the Jewish Sanhedrin would be like, who the crap are you talking about? Or if Joseph of Arimathea really did exist, but they didn't bury him in his tomb, then what would Joseph of Arimathea be saying? You didn't bury him in my tomb. All right, this is a kind of ring of truth accuracy that you get. Or another way to look at it is, when you lie, let me teach you how to lie. Don't give details. Because the more details you give, the easier it is to what? Expose the lie. All right, so I've helped you lie. I've done my job. All right, is what I'm doing. All right, so the burial story also lacks any signs of legendary embellishment, and that's why John A.T. Robinson, the guy that I just mentioned earlier, right, said, the honorable burial of Jesus is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. All right, so even secular scholars like John A.T. Robinson are quite firm that the honorable burial of Jesus is historically accurate. All right, let's go to our next fact. Our next fact is the empty tomb. All right, and all I'm saying here with this fact is the tomb was found empty. I'm not saying why it's found empty. See, if I'm explaining why it's empty, I'm trying to solve the case, right? I'm getting ahead of myself. Cart before the horse. I'm trying to uncover the clues. What facts can I know about Jesus? And we're saying the tomb was found empty. Again, why is the tomb found empty? How do we know the tomb was found empty? It is implied in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus died and he was buried and he rose from the grave. That sort of implies an empty tomb, right? Not overly compelling, right? But he also, the phrase, he was buried and was raised on the third day, that phrase on the third day is probably a reference to the women discovering the tomb empty on the third day. Also, the tomb narrative is found in the Gospel of Mark, right? So it's implied, at least implied, all right, in 1 Corinthians 15, but it is definitely mentioned in Mark. In fact, the empty tomb is mentioned in all four Gospels, right? Is what we have. The earliest source, it's one of our earliest sources that's multiply attested, with Mark and the like. It's on all four Gospels, as I said. It's a very simple story, right? They went to the tomb and they found it empty, and they're rather confused, And then they go tell the disciples, and do the disciples believe them? They're like, no, what are you talking about? So they got to go check it out for themselves is what they have to do. All right, so it's a very simple story. The tomb was found empty, and they're confused by it being empty. All right, compare this to other later sources about Jesus, like for the Gospel of Peter. Right? Now, don't look for the Gospel of Peter in your Bible. You're not going to find it. It's a Gnostic text that dates from like the I think the 2nd century. No, 3rd century, because it's like 200s. Yeah, it's 3rd century. All right, and the Gospel of Peter is a very legendary embellished account of the resurrection of Jesus. And what happened, I'll just give you the short, Steve Lee version, translation of Gospel of Peter. On the 3rd day after the death of Jesus, the women went to the tomb, that early morning, and the disciples also went to the tomb. In fact, the Sanhedrin got up and went to the tomb of Jesus. In fact, the entire freaking city woke up early that morning and went to the tomb of Jesus. And when the sun cracked over the horizon, 2 angels floated out of heaven. And they moved the stone away. They went into the tomb. And then they came out of the tomb, and the heads of the angels stretched to the clouds. And then there was a 3rd individual. Guess who that is? Jesus. And he's floating out of the tomb between the two angels, and his head stretched beyond the clouds. That's what you call big-headed Jesus. All right? You know, he really thinks a lot of himself there, doesn't he? All right? And then following the angels and Jesus is a flying cross, and it says to the crowd, "This is my son who has risen." Does it sound embellished?
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit, you know, just a little bit, right? So that's why people really didn't accept the Gospel of Peter as authentic historical information about Jesus. When you get to the empty tomb narrative, very simple story. Also, the empty tomb narrative seems to be historically accurate because who found it first?
The women.
The women found it first. What's the status of women in the first century world? Very low, right? They occupy one of the lowest rungs of the social ladder. Basically, property is what they are. Take a listen to these Jewish rabbinic expressions about women. "Let the words of law be burnt, then delivered by women." Or, "Happy is the man whose children are male." Guess I'm good. I got 2 boys. All right? I'm still not happy, you know, but I got 2 boys. All right? "Woe to him whose children are female." All right? Women weren't even allowed to give testimony in a court of law. See, if you're going to make up the empty tomb narrative and you want people to believe it, who would you have find it? Well, you'd have men find it because they're more believable. You wouldn't have women find it, you know, because of the status that they have. And what are the men doing as the women find the tomb empty? They're doing what?
Hiding.
They're hiding. But who wrote the story? The men wrote the story about the women finding the empty tomb as they're hiding. See, if I'm making this story up, I'm not hiding. I would be like, I went down to the tomb of Jesus and I pushed those sissy guards out of the way and I noticed that the tomb's rock was opened up and the tomb was empty and I came out and Jesus saw me and congratulated me on my great faith and I went home and I comforted the weeping women. See, that's the kind of story I'd make up about if I'm making this up. That's what men do. We love to overinflate, all right? It's all men here. It's okay to admit that. Isn't that what we do? It was this big. That's how big that fish was, you know. We love to overinflate. But women found the tomb empty. And the earliest Jewish response also admits to the empty tomb, all right? When the guards went back to the Sanhedrin and said the tomb is empty, the Sanhedrin paid the guards to tell everyone that the disciples did what?
Stole the body.
And if they stole the body, that makes the tomb what?
It was empty.
And that's the point, of what's going on. Maybe that's what happened as far as we know, but don't get ahead of ourselves, It's one of the earliest explanations, or trying to solve the case. But the empty tomb is early, it's multiply attested, lacks legendary embellishment, and there's no competing compelling story against it as well. So let's go to our third clue, the appearances of Christ. Now this one sounds like, oh, there you go, you're just assuming the resurrection, Steve, that's what you're doing. No. This is what I mean by appearances of Christ. It gives me a great acronym, first of all. That's why I'm using appearances of Christ. But here's what I mean. On multiple occasions, and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups experienced, and that's the operative word, experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. All right? Now, the operative word there is experienced, okay? They had some type of an experience in which they interpreted that experience as Jesus appearing alive from the dead. Maybe they're hallucinating, but if they're hallucinating, that's an experience. Maybe they're having bereavement experiences, right? I mean, people do have bereavement experiences. I remember my dad died about 15 years ago. I go over to my mom's house for a couple of months after he passed, and at 5 o'clock, I'm over there. She gets up. She says, "Jim," goes to the back door, and I'm like, what is she doing? He's been dead like a couple of months now. And she comes back, and she says, "I hear him come home at 5 o'clock every day," because that's what he did for 40 years. Now, did my mom have an experience? Absolutely. She had it's called a bereavement. It's a very common thing, especially for loved ones, spouses that lose a spouse, to have these type of bereavement experience. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself, right? All I'm saying is they had some type of an experience in which they understood Jesus alive from the dead. And again, this comes from 1 Corinthians 15, verse 8, where he actually lists people that experienced Jesus alive from the dead. That Jesus, appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, then to the 12, then the 500, and most of all, most of them are still alive, though some have fallen asleep or died. Then he appeared to James, that's the brother of Jesus, then to all the apostles. Last of all, to untimely one born, he appeared to me, right? So this, again, very early, sorts of information. Right? But he could be making up, this information, writing to the church of Corinth, which is on a different country altogether. But the appearances of Jesus are actually the most attested fact that I'm looking at. Right? The appearances of Jesus have occurred to Peter, which is recorded in Luke and Paul's writings. The appearances to the 12 is written about in Luke, John, and Paul's writings. The appearances of the women are in Matthew's gospel and John's gospel. The appearances in Galilee are in Matthew, Mark, and John. In fact, there's 12 different appearance narratives of Jesus alive from the dead. Right? So very early and very multiply attested. Secondly, even non-Christian scholars believe that these disciples had some type of experience of Jesus alive from the dead. I'll just quote Bart Ehrman. It is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. Paula Fredrickson, an historian at Harvard, said, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And that all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. She does not actually believe in the resurrection herself. Or E.P. Sanders, a Jewish scholar on the New Testament, says that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. Or Gerd Ludemann, a German scholar who does not believe in the resurrection, says it may be taken, listen to this language he uses, historically certain. I'll be honest, I don't even think you can do that in history. I think all history is probability. But this is his language. As a skeptic, not a believer in the resurrection, it can be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So even non-Christian scholars believe the appearances took place. Now, how does Gerd Ludemann think these experiences took place? Well, he thinks they had visions, which is a fancy theological word for hallucination. That's what it is. All right, so let's look at our last fact, transformation of the disciples. This is what I mean by T, transformation. The disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. All right, they did sincerely come to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and they had no reason to think it was going to occur. In fact, they're acting like it's not occurring because what are they doing? At Jesus' crucifixion, what are they doing? They're running and hiding. And so they are politically defeated. I mean, the Roman government has killed their leader as a political criminal, right? But nevertheless, they came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, right? That would be like, you understand what's going on? Hold on, right? This is like me coming to you today and say, hey, I have found the risen Messiah. And you'd be like, pray tell, who is it? Well, it's a death row inmate in Huntsville, Texas right now. And you'd be like, got any better candidates? Nope, that's it. That's the equivalent of what happened to Jesus, right? Quick question?
I was going to just make a note, obviously, in apocalyptic Judaism, the resurrection of the dead was going to happen at the end of the age, which, is the most popular.
Yeah, you're getting ahead of me there.
Yeah.
But they're also religiously defeated, according to Jewish law. Jesus' execution on a cross, a tree, means he's cursed by God. He's a heretic. They're like, oh my gosh, the Roman soldiers are coming after me. That's why they're hiding. And dude, I really screwed the pooch on this one because now God thinks that this guy that I followed is a heretic. He's being cursed by hanging on a tree. And then as your point, they are eschatologically defeated because Jewish belief about the afterlife, right, which we actually know quite a bit about, they believe that the resurrection of the dead will occur at the end of the world, at the end of the ages, not prior to that. So they're not expecting an individual resurrection prior to the mass resurrection of all Jews at the end of the world. But nevertheless, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God raised him from the dead. They were willing to die for that belief. All right? Now, Tradition says they all died, and were martyred. We're not quite sure about all of them, but Sean McDowell, you probably heard of him. He's the son of Josh McDowell. He actually did his doctoral dissertation on the fate of the disciples. And he says 6 of the 12 certainly and historically died for their belief in the resurrection, right? It meets this criteria, right? And he actually did a historical analysis of it, all right? Now, let me pause, make sure you understand what I'm saying, what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Jesus certainly rose from the dead because they were willing to die for the belief in the resurrection. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they sincerely believed in the resurrection because they're willing to die for it. They might be sincerely wrong as far as I know, but their sincerity is definitely unquestionable because they're willing to die for it. So there was some kind of transformation that occurred. Y'all track with me on this? All right. So we got 4 facts: burial, empty tomb appearances, and transformation that meets the criteria of historical facts about the past that are early sources, multiple sources, lack embellishment, and no competing story against it, okay? So we've now got our clues. As good detectives, now guess what we get to do? Solve the case, all right? Or provide the best explanation, all right? So I'm running out of space. Best explanation. All right, how do we determine out of a pool of options what is the best explanation, right? And this is what historians have actually come up with, right? And there's like 7, but I only got time for 2, all right? These are the 2 most important, is the best explanation for historical facts are going to be 1, have explanatory scope, and 2, have explanatory power, all right? Now, what do I mean by these 2? There's some others, but I don't have time to get into them, all right? Explanatory scope and power. What do I mean by explanatory scope and power? All right, and this goes back to sort of what we were talking about here. Explanatory scope, it explains all the facts, or most of the facts. All right? Really, you want to explain all of them is what you want to do, all right, if you can. All right? And explanatory scope is the explanation explains each fact adequately, not ad hoc or superficially, in a contrived manner. All right? Let me give you an example of explanatory scope and power. All right? In a few minutes, I'm going to leave and go home. And I expect my wife and son to be there, right? And when I drive up to the house, which I live in Garland, as I said earlier, I notice the back door is wide open. You do not leave your door open in Garland. I mean, seriously, that's inviting all the criminals in, And then as I walk into the house, not only is the back door wide open, the TV's on, the lights are on, but no one's in there watching the TV or the like. I go into the kitchen, and on the stove, there's food cooking on the stove and in the oven, but no one's tending to the food. I go to the back hallway, lights on the hallway, go to each bedroom, all the bedroom lights are on, radio's on, but no one's home. So here are the facts. Everything is on, everything's open, no one is home. What can explain why everything is on, everything is open, and no one is home? Here's a possible explanation. The reason everything is on, everything is open, and no one is home is my wife was cooking dinner for me. Oh, how sweet of her, right? There's always hoping. All right, so anyways, she's cooking dinner. She realizes she's missing an ingredient. And so she leaves, takes my son with her, and goes to the store to get the ingredient. Now, if she leaves to go to the store, what fact is explained?
Why they're not there.
Why they're not there. But what is not explained?
The door open.
Yeah, well, seriously. I mean, you got air conditioning. Have you ever had like your mom or dad? We're not trying to air condition the whole neighborhood. Like the old, I'm an old man. I do that now. So my dad did it to me. Now I do it to my kids. All right. And then it's like crime rates. We're inviting crime. And the like. I mean, the fire hazard. On the stove. I mean, seriously. Let's have a little talk here. So it doesn't explain why everything is on, everything is open. It doesn't explain why no one's home. So it explains one fact, but not all the facts, so it lacks what? It lacks scope. All right, here's another possible explanation. I definitely will have scope with this explanation. Why everything is on, everything is open, and no one is home is aliens have abducted my family. All right, now if aliens have abducted my family, that makes my home what? Empty. And do aliens care about crime rates in Garland? Or my electric bill? Or fire hazards? They care about all those kind of things. All right? So it doesn't, so that would explain why everything is on and open and no one is home. It explains all facts. There you go. It's the best explanation. But this seems to lack what? Power. It lacks convincibility, right? It doesn't seem seriously? I mean, if aliens actually did exist, which we don't know, why would they come to Garland? There's a lot better places to go to. DC, Paris, Moscow, somewhere else than Garland. Seriously. So it's got scope, but it lacks power, right? Third possible explanation for why everything is on, everything is open, and is known as home. It's because my son was watching the YouTubes, and have you ever heard of free running, right? Or parkour, right? He was watching that on the YouTubes, and he decided to get on the roof and jump onto the tree, and he misses, and he falls down, and he breaks his arm with a compound fracture. That's where the bone is sticking out of the skin, and there's blood shooting out with the heartbeat. No, it's a little too graphic, sorry. All right? And my wife rushes him to the hospital. And that actually might explain why she leaves things on. Even she tries to turn things off. She's concerned for the well-being of my son. I mean, what would we think of her? She says, well, hold on, Josh, let me finish the beans, and then we'll go to the doctor. That explains why everything is on, everything is open, and is known as home. Now, there might be a better explanation, but it will have scope and better power. All right, does it make sense to y'all? All right, that being said, all right, okay, I got to move through this quickly. All right, I did all that. Oh, there we go. All right, here we go. Here's possible explanations. Disciples lied. Does that seem likely?
Fairly likely. Yeah, it's very possible.
Yeah, if they lied about it, though,
Yeah.
it doesn't explain this.
It explains why they would act like they've transformed, right?
Yeah, usually when you lie, you're trying to get something out of it, aren't you? Like maybe you're trying to get power, fame, the ladies, or the like, But did they get any of that? No. Okay, maybe. I'm not talking about what is possible. What is the most likely situation? What happened? What the disciples got from belief in the resurrection?
They all died.
Death, persecution. They're ostracized from their community. And the like. It doesn't seem to really explain that at all. And if they're lying about it, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. Because if they're lying about it, all they have to do is go to the occupied tomb and go, you freaking liars. You're going to hell, for lying about the resurrection of Jesus. Because here's his dead body, and parade it down the street of Jerusalem in the movement, and that lie is exposed.
Aren't we assuming if they stole the body, they would have also stolen, or if they lied about it, they would have stolen the body?
Well, that's another one. It's conspiracy. It's adding on to the lie. It's a little bit better explanation, because if they stole the body, that makes the tomb what?
Empty.
It does make it empty, but they still know it's a lie. And it's very unlikely they're going to die for a lie knowing it's a lie. Now, people do die for lies thinking it's true, but most people aren't going to die for a lie knowing it's a lie unless they're getting something out of it. And every time by the third beating, they're like, you know what? This is really not working out for me. I'm going to go back to fishing, because no one's killing me for fishing. I'm getting a little more out of it is what's going on, right? And then the appearances weren't just to the disciples. It was to unbelievers as well, right? So it doesn't explain all the appearances as well. Another one is called swoon or apparent death theory, that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He passed out, revived in the tomb, got out, appeared to the disciples. And that would explain why the tomb is empty if he got out of the tomb. It would explain the appearances because he's showing up after his death, supposed death, but this is a very poor explanation because the burial fact says that Jesus died. So this doesn't explain a fact, it explains away a fact. An explanation should explain facts, not explain away facts. And then the transformation of the disciples, first of all, this seems very physically implausible. You got a emaciated, beaten Jesus that now has to move a rock out of the way. But maybe he's Hulk Jesus because he's a carpenter, so maybe he's jacked. I like a good superhero movie, so he moves the stone out of the way. And what's on the other side of the rock? The guards, they're going to finish the job, but maybe he's Hulk Ninja Jesus, and he sneaks past the guards. He finds the disciples who are what? Hiding, but he finds them, shows up, and says, look, I've defeated death in his bloody, beaten, emaciated state. I think the disciples are like, beat death? I don't know. Maybe barely escape because you're in dire need of medical attention right now. I don't think this is going to evoke worship of, hey, you're the God of life and death itself because you defeated death. Right? So it doesn't explain all the facts and seem very poor. Hallucination is by far the most likely, the most common explanation that's given for these facts, and it seems to get some traction. Right? If the disciples hallucinated Jesus like a bereavement experience, all right, it admits to the burial of Jesus, the death and burial. If they're hallucinating, well, that explains the experiences they're having of him appearing alive from the dead. And they might be confused in thinking that, hey, he actually defeated death, and they transform for the belief in the resurrection. Couple of problems, though. It doesn't explain the empty tomb at all, right? Because if they are hallucinating, the opponents of the Christian movement would just say, you're just hallucinating. Here's the dead body of Jesus in the movement. Also, hallucinations. It explains some appearances, but hallucinations are highly individualistic experiences. Right? It's sort of like dreams. When you dream as an individual. You don't dream in groups. Right? And the appearances weren't just to individuals. The appearances were to groups of people. Right? As well. And it wasn't just to believers or followers of Jesus. It was to people who were skeptical of Jesus, like like James, the brother of Jesus. He didn't believe, Jesus was the Messiah. I mean, seriously, he was his brother. That's got to suck to have Jesus as a brother, quite honestly. Can you imagine that, Mary? James, can't you be more like your brother Jesus? Come on, he's God. It's not fair. Anyway, back to the story, right? It explains some appearances, but not all appearances, because some of them were with groups. That'd be like me waking up this morning and turning over and saying to my wife, I had this really cool dream last night. Did you enjoy it? She'd be like, what are you, a freaking idiot? What's wrong with you? You had the dream, you moron. And that's how hallucinations work. So it explains some appearances, but not all appearances. Don't explain the empty tomb. All right. So those are some possible explanations for these four facts. So some explanations are just so stupid, I won't entertain them. Like aliens abducted the body of Jesus, put a holographic image of Jesus, in front of the disciples, and they thought Jesus wrote. And that's about the dumbest thing I ever heard. So if you want to believe that, okay, stupid people go to hell, or something like that. That was a little rude. I'm sorry. All right, so, but evangelism is not my gift. So anyways, all right. Last explanation, probably the one that you most likely heard, is that God raised Jesus from the dead. All right? Now, before we go, woohoo, touchdown Jesus, let's go home and celebrate Easter, let's make sure it explains all the facts. If God raised Jesus from the dead, that admits that Jesus died and was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, doesn't it? If God raised Jesus from the dead, that explains why the tomb is empty. If God raised Jesus from the dead, that explains why Jesus is appearing alive from the dead. And if God raised Jesus from the dead, that explains why the disciples are willing to die for the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. Right? It explains all the facts, scope, and each fact adequately, power. The only thing you really need with this explanation is God's existence. Okay? And if it's possible that God exists, which I think that is definitely a possibility, at least a possibility, then it is an explanation that I can explore to explain these four facts. And I think it's rational to believe in the resurrection. All right, questions, comments? Yep.
I really like how Justin Bass,
Yeah, Justin Bass. Yeah, I remember him.
Yeah, everybody can have their own opinion on how to present this. William Lane Craig actually did a podcast on Justin Bass' presentation and was critical because Justin kind of goes into the legacy of Jesus as evidence for the resurrection. And Craig, when he did his podcast, he was kind of like, well, I don't really like that because there's so many religions that succeed, quote unquote. But I really like Justin's approach to it because, I would say Justin takes probably maybe like a 25% step back from the power of the claims that you're making about this evidence. Right?
Yeah.
All of it's historical, but he would maybe say like, 4 of the 12, we really have good evidence that they really believed after Jesus died. And that he might be more open to like later dating, all that. I would say he's probably 25% less.
I understand.
But what he does is, he goes on, as a minister, he's really good at this, tying the legacy of Jesus and say, hey, look, Muhammad, conquered his way across the world. Jesus is this peasant who, we celebrate his birthday, and every year that marches forward is Jesus plus one, Jesus plus two. I mean, it's a tremendous legacy, and despite what anybody may have to say about what's going on with the state of Israel, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah of Israel, and it's because of his legacy and the relationship to Judaism that Israel's been reconstituted. I mean, there's all of this legacy, this significant legacy surrounding this particular person who has a pretty plausible miracle story. So that's where I personally connect to it, because I don't know if I've told you, Steve, but I've identified as a Christian for about 5 or 6 years.
No, I've never heard that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've heard, last I heard was you're a theist.
Yeah.
So and you've been progressing. That's good. That's good to hear.
I've identified as but my approach to this is I think that if you come at it, with a kind of a scientific, lens, right? You can use these other explanations to say, okay, if we tie a bunch of stuff together, we can come up with a pretty plausible explanation of kind of some of the stuff you went over. I think you can get it to be more plausible, but I still think when you stand back and say, wow, there's a lot of crazy things that have happened, Salem witch trials, all kinds of crazy things, but very few of them have the cultural, world philosophical shaking impact that Jesus does. It's just crazy that it's surrounding this guy.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He has this
That's
story,
interesting.
This is the evidence. Even if you allow 25% more liberal historical take, it's still super amazing. So
Yeah.
and it's still the Jesus rose from the dead is still incredibly plausible, given even more slack to the evidence. Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just curious, like, what if you had someone who is like a hardcore believer in aliens? They're like, there's tons of aliens in Area 51. They're all over the place. We just don't, see them all the time. And they said, yeah, aliens were the ones behind Jesus.
Okay, let's just go. Aliens exist. Well, to go with the explanations aliens exist, then you have to have some background information to explain these things, right? And just saying that it's a possibility, that's not an explanation. There's lots of possibilities, I mean, maybe Gandalf stole the body of Jesus and did a phantom body of Jesus with his wizarding staff. That's a possibility, But what you're going to have to do is once they present, like aliens or Gandalf, now I'm going to ask, well, what's your evidence for aliens? What's your evidence for Gandalf? Just like someone say, what's your evidence for God? And that's a fair question to ask. I said, well, I think God's the best explanation for those things that I mentioned before in morality, origins, and design of the universe, and they would have to do the same for like Gandalf existing or aliens existing. And then you're like, well, what would be like the motivation of aliens doing this, as well, I mean, it's sort of weird getting real sort of like Scientology at this point, because that's actually what L. Ron Hubbard actually believes, that, we'll stop there. That's my favorite cult, Scientology, right? Anyways, yeah.
Are there any notable examples of skeptics who were converted to Christianity from examining the evidence for the resurrection?
Yeah, Frank Morrison was a British lawyer or barrister. I don't know what they call him in England. He was a lawyer, and he wrote a book called Moving the Stone. And he was convinced by the evidence. He actually provided legal evidence for the resurrection. That's a little more dated book because that was like 19th century. More recently, Lee Strobel was one, right? He was convinced by the evidence as well. I was thinking of J. Warner Wallace, right? And he is actually a police detective, right? That's actually where I get this idea. Using history as being like a detective. It's from J. Warner Wallace. He actually grew up as an atheist, joined the police force in California. His police buddies who are Christians said, why aren't you a Christian? There's no evidence for it. And they said, well, why don't you apply your detective skills to the New Testament and see if it, measured up, to your skills as a detective. And he did, and he converted. right? He actually wrote about it in a book called Cold Case Christianity, right? Which is actually a really fascinating read because he actually shows you, if you're really into crime stuff, that's the book you want to read, because he'll like go into like crime, how something is done, and then applies it to the New Testament or the resurrection. It's a really fascinating read, So and there's others, that have done that as well. But those are the ones that come to mind. All right. Yeah, back in the back, and then we'll call it a night.
What is your opinion about the combined theory that in addition to hallucinations?
Yeah, when you sort of like go through them, right? Hey, could we like combine hallucination with the disciples lied?
Yeah.
I've actually done this, right? Now I don't have time to get into it, but I've actually tried to mix and match explanations, the naturalistic explanations, and what happens is they become mutually exclusive to one another. Actually, is what they do. So let's go and let's try one. All right.
Like a reburial and then hallucinations one?
A reburial, right? See, that's a fact that you would have to have an early source, multiple source, lack of embellishment, and no competing story against it. So I have no compelling reason to think that that's a fact because it doesn't meet those historical criteria. But let's just go with the explanation. The disciples lied and then they hallucinated.
Stole the body.
They stole the body and then they hallucinated. To what's going on. Well, if they stole the body and they're hallucinating, then they should know they're hallucinating because they just did what?
I think you'd have to
Stole the body,
I think you'd have to say something more plausible would be like maybe a few of the disciples.
Yeah, you got to get more narrow.
And
Yeah,
then,
that's true.
Like maybe 2 or 3 his family members were like, you know what, this is our brother. We want to remove him because we don't want to leave him here in Jerusalem. These cultists to admire. So they take him away, right? They don't tell anybody about it. The women go to the tomb. They find it. It's empty. They go back. People start. The rumor spreads. It's empty. The apocalyptic Jews, they're like, the resurrection has begun. He's the first fruits. It's called in the New Testament, first fruits resurrection.
Yeah.
So then they're starving themselves. They're deep in meditation and fasting, and they're speaking in tongues, because they're on into ecstatic stuff, John the Baptist. So they have these visions, and then there you go. That's the whole thing. Like Paul says, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than any of you. He talks about going into trances to the 7th heavens.
Yeah.
So we have reasonable belief that some of these guys were doing some ecstatic stuff. So I would say that's the best naturalistic approach, and
Yeah, I would tend to think so too.
Yeah.
The only response I would say to this is, one, you have diminishing probabilities. The more explanations you provide, the more and more unlikely it could really occur. Because now you got like this massive conspiracy going on and confusion, and the like, and you're just like, for example, I remember reading, you've heard of Chuck Colson? You ever heard of Chuck Colson? He's part of the Nixon administration that got hammered on Watergate, and Colson, he suffered for it. He went to prison. He said the 12 most powerful men in the world couldn't keep a secret. You're thinking a fisherman can, and the like. So you got this weird diminishing probabilities. You also have Occam's razor that I would actually apply to it. And Occam's razor it's not the simplest explanation, it's the best explanation. That's a misrepresentation of Occam's razor. But it's the explanation that explains the most without needlessly adding entities or unnecessary, facts or explanations for it. And once you start adding that up, then you're starting to break Occam's razor, and the weight of it becomes too heavy, I think. And hence why I think, well, yeah, you could go that route, and I can understand why naturalists would go that. But at the same time, I'd be like, I think God raising from Jesus from the dead is a rational explanation. And I think that's one we ought to at least entertain. And that's all I'm really doing here. I'm not an evangelist. I'm not going to have an altar call right now, or anything. I'm just like, I think this is a rational explanation that is cognitively, or more precisely, epistemically allowable for me to hold.
Yeah, I would say a chief component of it does Jesus rising from the dead have verisimilitude with your own spiritual experience? I would say that's the most important thing about Christianity and the Christian evidence, is, supposedly Jesus is alive. You can actually talk to him, pretty much anytime you want, and have some kind of, sensus divinitatis, that
Yeah.
in your heart that he's alive and well, So, is the spiritual experience you have with Jesus, does that bear verisimilitude with what you're presenting, the fact that he actually did rise from the
Yeah.
dead? Because, like you said, it could, who knows, but that accords with our own,
Yeah.
and that's just a personal.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks so much for having me talk about this as we move into the Easter season. So thanks so much.